Hello everyone, it's Micah. I haven't fixed my camera angle yet. That's still to come. I haven't taken any editing lessons, so that's still to come. You're going to see a video that looks an awful lot like the first video, but hopefully the content will set it apart. Last video, I just wanted to set the stage for what I'm trying to do with the nascent Make Music Better project. And for those of you who commented on the first video, thank you for your feedback. And I have not gotten in to respond to those comments yet, but I will. And it occurred to me that I was going to just launch right into this by starting with my musical home base, which was Janet Jackson and her first two albums. And that would have been a great topic for discussion, especially for today, because today, Friday, April the 14th, is the opening night of the Janet Jackson Together Again tour in Hollywood, Florida. I, of course, am wearing a t-shirt from her Vegas residency to commemorate the opening of the tour today, and I'm excited to see her in a couple of weeks here in Atlanta for both shows she's doing here. So that would have been a great thing to talk about today, but it occurred to me that, wait a minute, not everybody knows me. But, well, to be fair, probably most of the people who are watching the video know me personally, but for anybody who doesn't, the question, the elephant in the room I would assume to be, why Janet? Why is that your musical home base? You didn't grow up in Middle Tennessee and Southern Kentucky with Janet Jackson as part of your cultural tradition. You obviously picked it up at some point during your life. I did not grow up in Gary, Indiana. I did not grow up in the Jackson household, and I did not grow up listening, at least initially, listening to pop music and R&B. So why would Janet Jackson be my musical home base? Well, so I thought it would be worth using this video to take a journey, a very fast journey of my musical exposure from birth up through Janet, and so you can understand why and how I got to that place as my musical home base. So that's what I want to cover in this video. So pardon my self-indulgence here, but really for me to properly address the musical criticism, the musical perspective that I'm trying to convey, I feel like I need to lay a bit of a foundation. So these first few videos will be especially self-indulgent, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. So I was born, and I'm not gonna go back, and I'm very tempted to do the opening of The Jerk by Steve Martin, but I will not. I grew up in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, Southern Kentucky, the Nashville area. And so a lot of my early exposure to music was country, bluegrass, gospel. I wasn't steeped in it. I didn't sit around the campfire and listen to my family sing folk songs and play the banjo. There's nothing quaint about my musical upbringing, but those types of influences were in the background and they were around me. And of course, a big part of what I heard incidentally was country music, because I was in the Nashville area and I was literally in the country, a couple of counties away from Nashville. And so I understand country music, but from a very early age, I understood that it wasn't my language. Country music didn't really speak my language. And to some degree, I think I inherited that. And so in its own weird way, me getting to the point where I became a fan of Janet Jackson was a two-generation tradition in and of itself, because my father, who grew up in that same area of Tennessee and literally was a hillbilly, literally grew up on the hills in the hills, and he might have, and I think he probably would have had stories about sitting around a campfire and playing music and singing folk songs. He himself played the harmonica. I know in our family there were banjos around. I don't know that I ever heard anybody actually playing them, but I know that there was a banjo at my great uncle's trailer up on the hill, the ridge, as it were. And so, I mean, I was in very close proximity to these musical influences, but nobody in my family was particularly musical. The one thing I will say is that my father had a preoccupation with 50s rock and roll music. And much the same way that the music of the 80s would come out of nowhere and inspire me, the music of the 50s came out of whatever it came out of and inspired him. I won't say it came out of nowhere, because a big component of 50s rock and roll is actually country music. And that was a way in for him. That was part of it that made sense for him, because a lot of the rock and roll was an outgrowth of what we might today call rockabilly, or more aggressive, upbeat country music. And part of it was folk music, which is the sort of stuff that amateur musicians in the country and up on the hills would be playing, and he would have been exposed to. And those are some important components of rock and roll. So there was that, but it was also the novelty of it, the fact that the blues and R&B and gospel influences came into play as well. So regardless of exactly how he got plugged into it, there's no doubt that rock and roll was the musical language of the youth of the 50s. It was exciting, it was new, it was different, and my father was 200% on board, and he spent a good deal of time as I was a kid attempting to indoctrinate me that no greater music ever existed than the 50s rock and roll music. He adored Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, which, you know, the Little Richard part gives me pause, because I'm struggling a bit with that, because, you know, in retrospect, it's very obvious that Little Richard would be problematic for a lot of conservative people, and my dad was conservative. I don't know if my dad just chose not to recognize the influences that were apparent in Little Richard's music, or if he just saw it as exciting and didn't really think too much about what was really going on there. I mean, if you look back at the original lyrics of Tutti Frutti, sort of makes some modern stuff by, like, say, R. Kelly or somebody who's a little more provocative within the past generation, makes it look kind of tame. Little Richard was out there. Jerry Lee Lewis was out there in his own way as well. But regardless, my father had a sense of adventure when it came to music, and he, at that time, was listening to music that was in the vanguard, that was of the moment. And I guess you could say I inherited that from him. The other place where I was exposed to music as a kid was the church. My father was actually a minister, but he was a minister in the Church of Christ, which, let's just say, it doesn't have the strongest musical tradition. Church of Christ does a cappella music, and it does it strictly for the purpose of praise. There's not any real artistry or instrumentation, or really any pride in how the music is presented. It's very bare. I'll just speak for the church that I went to, but I think a lot of them were similar. It was really all about the praise component of it. There was nothing there was no element of excellence, of musical excellence. There was no lifting up. We didn't have choirs, and we didn't have instruments, and there were no solos. It was really the whole essence of the Church of Christ was, if you for 1 second take your eye off of the worship aspect of what you're doing, or you make one comment that isn't biblically supported, then you are way out of bounds. And that was that. So my musical church background was incredibly uninspiring. I got next to nothing. In fact, I, if anything, have an active aversion to gospel music because of my exposure early on. So, and that's unfortunate, because I think I could gain a lot from tapping into some gospel influences. And I rediscovered some of them via my interest in R&B, but for me, faith-based music was a big no-go when I was a kid. That was the place you went to hear really, really bad singing. It wasn't a place that was inspiring from a musical standpoint. And so growing up as a young child in the late 70s and in the early 80s, my parents tried to shield me from secular music for the most part. They weren't all the way on board with that. They had I won't say very extensive. They had a decent record collection, vinyl record collection, and when I was bored or just needed something to do, I would play those records. And there were some that I ended up liking better than others, but they were mostly not gospel records. So my parents did dabble in secular music, and I would listen to those records. The only one that really stuck out for me, though, was the cassette tape that my father bought. That was really just a compilation of greatest hits from the 50s. And that was his most direct way of trying to indoctrinate me. And I did end up listening to that one cassette tape a lot. I do remember, in particular, Great Balls of Fire being on there, but there were other just monumental rock and roll 50s classics on there. And I thought the songs were okay, but they didn't really do a lot for me, and they sounded dated as far as I was concerned. At this point, the rock and roll that was on the radio, the stuff that I was exposed to peripherally, was already, two decades plus beyond that sound, and 50s was already very retro in the late 70s and early 80s. And I do remember incidentally listening to the radio when we went on car trips, which was very often because we were in the middle of nowhere. So to get to somewhere to go out to eat or to go shopping or visit people, normally we had to drive at least an hour to get anywhere, and a lot of times we would have the radio on. I do remember specifically songs that I didn't have any other exposure to at the time, but somehow or other they stuck in my head. And later on, when I knew the artist and got re-educated in pop music, I remembered those songs from those car rides. Among the songs I remember listening to were "The Tide Is High" by Blondie, "Dirty Laundry" by Don Henley, just a lot of songs that came out around early 1980s. And my parents didn't really want me listening to the music, but they also weren't going to sit through a silent car ride. So we would incidentally listen to music. They didn't know too much about it. They were just listening to have something on. But I did pick up some sounds in those songs that I thought were exciting. And I thought, oh, well, this is worth looking into. Then the summer of 1982, my mother got a job. She had been a homemaker my entire life up to that point, so I stayed at home. That summer she got a job in a factory, and I went to a babysitter. And that was the summer that I discovered popular music, because I was there with several other kids. Two of the kids were my age, and they taped songs off the radio, so they had a tape that they would listen to over and over, and then there was the radio itself where we could listen to songs that were out at the time. So this was an incredible window into a whole new world. So I heard lots of new music that summer, and that's when I started getting interested. And so from there I started listening to the radio, and I started developing my taste in music. My very first favorite group was Men at Work, and I think I actually started liking them maybe even earlier than that, because someone in my family maybe had their cassette tape and I was listening to it. I just remember really liking them because they were quirky, and they had the song Down Under with the flute solo, which was very interesting and different. And Colin Hay, I think that's the lead singer's name. He had a very distinctive, interesting, emotive voice as well, and comical at times. And of course, funny is always great for a kid under 10 years old to keep a kid's interest. So from there, I started developing my musical taste, and what I found was that right away I gravitated towards soundtracks. Well, two soundtracks in particular, Flashdance and then Footloose. And I was really looking for a bang for my buck, because I started thinking about cassette tapes that I wanted to buy. That was the music format at the time. It was the most convenient format. Albums were unwieldy and large. Cassette tapes were more portable and easier to manage, even though you had to sit through getting them to fast forward and rewind to get to the song you wanted to listen to, unless you just wanted to sit through and listen to all the other songs that were filler or just time wasters while you got to the song that you wanted to listen to. It was a far cry from where I could just say, "Hey Siri, play Enjoy by Janet Jackson."
Enjoy.
"Hey Siri, please stop." "Hey Siri, please stop." So, yes, we did not have that technology in the early 80s. It was sit and wait for a tape to rewind to get to the song you wanted. And it had to be one of the 8 songs that was on the tape that you were listening to, not millions of records that are at your fingertips with a voice command. I don't take that for granted. So anyway, the first 2 records I got were those 2 soundtracks, because they had several hits on them that I heard on the radio, and they were from different artists, so I didn't have to commit to listening to the same person sing 8 songs in a row. From there, I, like everybody else, found Michael Jackson captivating, and so I got the Thriller album, and then I also got the Can't Slow Down album by Lionel Richie. I never was a huge fan of his, but the songs were all catchy, and so he released like 5 or 6 off that album, so I knew enough songs off of it that I knew I wanted to get it, so I ended up getting it. But after those records, I started settling into a groove where I developed a clear preference for British, what they called synthpop or synth pop music at the time. And my big 4 artists that I really got into were Culture Club, Duran Duran, Eurythmics, and Thompson Twins. All British, all heavily produced albums with a lot of up-to-date technical synthesized elements in them. And to me, that was the wonderful, mind-blowing, novel music that really excited me. These sounds that I had never heard in music. I grew up listening to guitars and banjos and fiddles, and it sounded kind of drab and trite and even depressing to hear these very organic sounding instruments. So these exotic electronic based sounds being manipulated to make music was really, really intriguing to me. And of course, my father thought it was, I won't say terrible, but he was not a fan. My mother was always completely agnostic to most any of my interests, any of my outside interests. She pretty much shrugged her shoulders at whatever it was that I was interested in. But I really got into those 4 groups, and then later on, those 4 were joined by Wham. So I pretty much went into this era where I was exclusively British groups. But the funny thing was, and what I didn't realize at the time, all of those groups were really R&B based groups. And I find that so intriguing. Thompson Twins were probably the least R&B, but there was definitely some soulful elements to their music. But they were probably the most pop of those four groups. But for sure, Annie Lennox was heavily influenced by soul, and the great sonic impact of Eurythmics is the fact that Annie Lennox's voice is so soulful and so heartfelt, and putting her voice up against these cold electronic blips and drum machines was a very striking contrast. Culture Club was essentially a pop reggae R&B group, and Boy George was one of the most soulful vocalists in 80s pop music. Needless to say, George Michael was, who actually went on to have several R&B hits, was a soulful vocalist as well. And Duran Duran was also very interested in R&B rhythms and had R&B influences. And around the time that I got into them, they had at that point met up with Nile Rodgers from Chic, and he was producing a lot of their records, which was definitely adding a funk-based sound to what they were coming out with. So even though I thought I was being really exotic and by going across the pond and liking these British groups, a whole lot of what I enjoyed about what they were doing was the R&B element of what they were doing. In the meantime, like, I listened to whatever was on the radio, and there were individual songs here and there that I enjoyed, but nothing really coalesced. I was just sort of floating around, and because Wham was the most recent import from Britain, they were my favorite group for a good year or so, until 1986. And then in early 86, I started seeing this video on MTV from, God forgive me for saying this, because I always give other people a hard time for saying this, but from Michael Jackson's little sister, because that's what she was at the time, at least from a musical standpoint. And I saw What Have You Done For Me Lately on MTV, and I said, this is really interesting. I kind of like this. And I was cool with that, and I definitely enjoyed it, and I really liked the vibe she was giving off. But then one morning, I'm going to say it was May, maybe June, and I want to say it was right after summer break started from school. One morning, I woke up, turned on the radio, and this assault of sound hit me. It was the most incredible, most out of this world, most startling in a good way, musical amalgamation that I had ever heard in my life up to that point. And I sat there like, I don't know, my jaw was probably on the floor listening to this song. And that's the first time that I heard the song Nasty. And that morning, while I was still in my room and had just gotten out of bed, that morning my life changed. That morning when I heard that song, I said, you know what, this is it. This is my sound. This is my home base. And it sounds like one of those dramatic stories that gets embellished after the fact, but I was not quite 13 years old at the time, so I was almost a teenager, about the time when music becomes the most important thing in a person's life. And I had found my home base, because Janet was, number one, she was pop. She understood how to do pop music. She was an understudy to one of the greatest pop musicians ever. So she knew what she was doing there. Number two, the music was incredibly advanced from a technological standpoint. It was very electronic. It was very exotic. It checked all the boxes of what I enjoyed in the British musicians that I was listening to at the time.
And number 3, the R&B piece, which I didn't realize yet was my favorite type of music, but it was that influence, it was that soulfulness and that vibe from the R&B element, but except it wasn't recycled. It hadn't moved across the pond and then back over to me. This was the real stuff, direct from the U.S. And I mean, I definitely had listened to Thriller my share of times, and I was certainly familiar with other R&B artists like Tina Turner, and trying to think of who else was on the charts at the time. Yeah, I can't, like, my mind is blanking right now. I know there were other R&B artists that were hitting on the pop charts at the time, but I can't think of them. Like, I mentioned Lionel Richie, but I think of him as more pop in his solo work. So I had been exposed to some R&B music. I didn't quite get yet that was my favorite type of music. I thought that the syntho-pop, which is such a weird word to have to even say. Even at the time, it was hard to fix my mouth to say that. It didn't really sound like a real genre, but that's the closest I could come to when asked what I liked. Because I know my dad liked rock and roll, so I had to have an answer at the ready about what type of music I like. And so up to that point, I was saying synthpop. And to this day, I really don't like the word at all. But point is, this checked all the boxes for the music that I was currently saying was my favorite. And on top of that, it wasn't just something that I enjoyed. It was something that kind of went through me, you know, and drilled into other places of my being that the music that I said I liked up to that point didn't quite get to. And so that was when I decided that Janet Jackson was my person. She was the artist that was going to represent who I was and who was going to be that for me. And, you know, I discovered other artists over the years, and maybe I had a brief flash of that. It's sort of like when you meet the love of your life and you know, oh, this is the one. But then realistically, most of us also meet other people throughout the course of our lives where we briefly flirt with the idea of them being that one person or that one artist. And so I won't say that didn't happen other times where I'm like, oh, this artist is really interesting. They really move me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought that, well, maybe this is the artist to take Janet's place. But it never happened, and at this point, I don't think it's going to happen. But my point is, I don't want to overstate the certainty that I had at the time. But it was pretty earth-shaking for a not yet 13-year-old hearing that song and having that song have that kind of an impact. So that's the story in 28 long minutes of how I went from growing up in Tennessee to becoming a Janet Jackson fan. From that point on, it was just, the dominoes just fell after that. Everything she's put out since 1986, I've been on board with, and gladly too. It's never like she put out something and I felt disconnected from what she was doing. It's been a pretty consistent ride ever since then. Some things I've liked better than others, and some things I've been more connected with than others, and that's what I'm going to get into as I go over her recorded catalog. But that's how I got there, and so now I feel like I've explained myself sufficiently about why I say Janet Jackson is my musical home base. And from there, we'll go get into her first 2 albums, the ones that I didn't get a chance to listen to before I had my conversion in 1986. That would be her 1982 album that was named Janet Jackson. It was eponymous. And then her 1984 record, which was Dream Street. So I'll be talking about those the next time I check in. And if you've made it this far through the video, I appreciate you doing so. And I will be back to relate more of my musical history with Janet in the coming days.